Racist cop arrests black woman. Turns out she's state lawyer. Welcome to a story so shocking, so packed with drama, it will make you question everything you know about justice and power. Imagine a bright afternoon in New York City, where a routine traffic stop spirals into a life-changing encounter between a white police officer whose prejudices have festered unchecked and a poised, brilliant black attorney working for the state of New York. In the blink of an eye, a simple stop becomes an unjust arrest. But here's the twist: the cop has no idea who he's messing with. Stick around to witness how one act of prejudice triggers an explosive chain reaction. Neither will ever forget. Officer Richard Rick Monroe had served with the New York Police Department for nearly 12 years. Stationed at the 20 Honest Precinct in Manhattan, he prided himself on his old-school approach to policing. He believed in the chain of command, the code of silence, and a strict interpretation of serve and protect. But underneath the gleaming uniform and carefully combed hair lay something more insidious, a deep-seated prejudice that he rationalized as keeping order. Over the years, subtle comments from friends, telling jokes at the bar, and small, unchallenged biases had hardened into a corrosive worldview he rarely questioned. On this particular spring morning, the city was awash with golden sunlight, and Manhattan's bustling streets showed no signs of easing their relentless pulse. Bright yellow cabs zigzagged through traffic, street vendors shouted out for customers, and the sidewalks teemed with people from every conceivable background. The hum of the city was a comforting blanket for most, but for Rick, the day's shift already felt suffocating. Last night's argument with his wife about finances, spending habits, mounting bills, the usual domestic friction had him walking into the precinct with a chip on his shoulder. Exiting the station, he adjusted his duty belt, making sure his standard-issue Glock was snug in its holster. He patted his baton, handcuffs, and radio, as if double-checking an arsenal for war. Rick strolled to his patrol car, an older Crown Victoria that squeaked ominously whenever it hit a pothole. His partner, Officer Daniel Vega, was out sick, leaving Rick to ride solo. Though it wasn't unusual, he'd grown accustomed to having someone to talk to, or at least share, in the monotony of daily patrol. Today, he had only his thoughts, and those thoughts were dark. Weeks earlier, Rick had been passed over for promotion to sergeant for the third time. In hushed conversations, he blamed politics and favoritism. He told himself the department was trying to diversify by giving promotions to others less deserving. People would question him, "Don't you think you need to address the complaints on your record?" But Rick would just bristle. The official memos about his attitude with citizens never penetrated his stubborn self-image as a tough but fair officer. He pulled onto Lexington Avenue, glancing in the rear-view mirror. Traffic was light, but it was still Manhattan. Horns honked, bike messengers wove dangerously between cars, and business people hustled along the sidewalks, coffee in hand and earpieces in place. Rick's stomach growled. He'd skipped breakfast. He was just telling himself that his first stop would be the Starbucks on 35th when he caught a glimpse of a black sedan with tinted windows. Strictly speaking, tinted windows weren't illegal if they met the state's light transmittance requirements, but Rick felt compelled to run the plates anyway. Perhaps it was the occupant behind the wheel. He could faintly see the silhouette of a driver with dark, curly hair. He muttered, punching in the license plate number. All came back clean. No outstanding warrants, no stolen vehicle report, not even an unpaid parking ticket. Just a normal sedan. Still, he found his hand automatically reaching for the switch of the patrol car's lights. A small, nagging voice asked him, "What are you doing?" He ignored it. The truth was, part of Rick was itching to exert some authority, blow off some steam. He wanted a reason to pull someone over, especially someone who would annoy him enough to break the restless tension building inside him. He pressed the red and blue lights on, and the Crown Vic let out a short wail of the siren. The black sedan swerved gently to the right, stopping a few feet from a fire hydrant, but otherwise following standard procedure. Rick typed in a quick note on his onboard computer, "Traffic stop, tinted windows." He opened his door, stepped onto the asphalt, and tugged on his duty belt, an unconscious gesture that made him feel more secure. As he approached the driver's side window, he could see a woman behind the wheel. She was black, with refined features and wearing a crisp, navy blue blazer. She seemed strangely composed, not frantic or annoyed. Perhaps she was used to this sort of thing. That single observation already riled Rick. He half expected flustered compliance, maybe some meek apology. But instead, her expression was calm, waiting. She rolled down her window before he even tapped on it. "Good morning, officer," she said, politely, her voice clear and measured. "Is there a problem?" Rick paused, taken aback by the smoothness of her tone. "License and registration," he barked, ignoring her question. He didn't offer any pleasantries. Something about her presence, the confident gaze in her eyes, unnerved him. "Yes, of course," she responded. She reached for her purse, moving carefully and deliberately, as though she understood the stakes of every gesture in front of a cop. When she handed him her documents, he noticed her name, Ebony Hughes. He scanned the license. Everything looked valid. It even bore a star, indicating her compliance with enhanced ID requirements. There was no visible infraction here. Yet, as Rick's mind churned, he felt an inexplicable urge to escalate the situation. Maybe it was her unwavering stare, or maybe it was the frustration from home biting at his ego. Whatever the reason, he decided to press further. "Ma'am," he began, his tone far from polite, "these tinted windows look way over the legal limit." "They're certified, officer," Ebony replied. "I have the documentation if you need it. I've had them checked by the State Inspection Office." Her calmness only fueled his frustration. He studied her a bit more, how she held herself straight, not cowering, not overly deferential. Rick's heart pounded. He felt a rush of conflicting impulses. This wasn't going to be a routine stop, he decided. He had all day to make her sweat. "Step out of the car, Miss Hughes," he said, motioning for her to open the door. Ebony Hughes's heart thumped as she unclipped her seatbelt. She sensed a storm brewing behind the officer's cold, restless eyes. She had experienced petty harassment before she'd grown up in one of Atlanta's working-class neighborhoods before moving north, but she'd never fully grown numb to the sting of unwarranted suspicion. Yet she remained composed. She was, after all, a practicing attorney, admitted to the New York State Bar. If she panicked now, it would only feed whatever narrative this officer was spinning in his mind. "Certainly, officer," she said, opening the door slowly and stepping out. Her heels clicked on the asphalt. She carefully closed the car door behind her. Passing traffic whooshed by, but nobody seemed to pay them much attention. New York had a way of ignoring public scenes, and it simultaneously irritated and relieved Ebony. Rick stood with his arms folded. "Hands where I can see them," he demanded, eyes roving over her. He clocked the subtle gold chain around her neck, her neatly manicured nails, and the expensive watch adorning her wrist. He couldn't place exactly why these details got under his skin. Maybe it was that this woman had better taste than he did, or that she wore her success in plain sight. Ebony obeyed. "Officer, I'm happy to comply with any lawful request, but I would like to know the reason for this stop." He stared at her, letting a beat of silence linger. "I don't need to be lectured on the law, ma'am," Rick snapped. "That's my job." She inhaled deeply, measuring her words carefully. "I understand that. I'm not attempting to lecture you. I just want to make sure we're clear about what's happening. What's clear is that you have tinted windows that appear illegal and you're being combative," Rick retorted, voice brimming with hostility. "Now turn around." Ebony hesitated. "Combative? I'm simply asking a question. I'm not resisting you in any way." Rick took a step closer, looming over her. "Are you disobeying a lawful order?" he asked, enunciating each word. His hand drifted near his holster, not quite touching it, but coming dangerously close. That moment crystallized for Ebony that this situation had escalated beyond normalcy. She was a woman who knew her rights, but she also knew the precariousness of the situation. It was a volatile mixture, a cop with a chip on his shoulder and a black woman who refused to be cowed. Lives had been ruined for far less. Slowly, deliberately, Ebony turned around. Her mind raced. Should she mention she was an attorney, or would that provoke him further? In her experience, disclosing her legal background often changed the dynamic, usually for the better, but occasionally it riled officers who despised anyone talking law to them. Rick patted her down, arguably more aggressively than necessary. His hands pressed along her sides, over her blazer, and down her legs. It was humiliating, but Ebony stood rigid, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. Passers by continued to bustle by, some throwing curious glances, but no one intervened. She noticed Rick's breath quickening. "You got any weapons, Miss Hughes? Any drugs in the car?" "None," she answered steadily. "You sure?" he persisted. 100%. His tone was sneering. "Maybe I'll just take a look for myself." Ebony pivoted her head just enough to see him out of the corner of her eye. "You have no probable cause for a search, officer," he scoffed, stepping back and crossing his arms again. "Listen, Miss Hughes, you don't tell me about probable cause." "Are you an attorney or something?" he asked in a mocking tone. Ebony held her breath a second longer. Then she answered, "As a matter of fact, I am." Rick's eyebrows shot up, but he quickly concealed his surprise with a mocking grin. "Oh, is that right? Big-time lawyer. And I suppose you think that makes you special?" She didn't respond, letting the question hang in the air. She hoped he would realize the futility of continuing this charade, but his expression only hardened. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back," he said. This was the turning point, Ebony realized. "Am I under arrest?" "You're being detained for obstructing a police investigation," Rick said, though he sounded almost uncertain himself. Failure to cooperate. She hesitated. Her rational mind told her to comply, but her pride screamed in protest. Yet Ebony also knew that this single moment could define her future. A sudden move, a defiant gesture, could lead to the unthinkable. So she nodded. With slow, deliberate motions, she placed her wrists together behind her back, feeling the cold steel of handcuffs snap into place. He guided her toward the patrol car, his grip far too tight on her arm. With each step, Ebony felt a swell of anger rising in her chest. She was well aware that this was not a lawful arrest. It was a product of bigotry, hostility, and a gross abuse of power. But for now, she bit her tongue. She would let the system handle this. She would handle this. Rick opened the back door and all but shoved her in. The hum of the city was muffled once inside the cramped interior. Ebony's breath came in short bursts, her mind already racing ahead to the precinct and the possible humiliation awaiting her. She thought of her colleagues, her clients, her reputation. Panic threatened to swamp her, but she summoned the discipline she'd honed in law school and during countless trials. She forced herself to think clearly. Gather the facts, don't resist, don't escalate, document everything. From the driver's seat, Rick radioed in. Ebony could only catch snippets: suspect, combative, possible illegal tint. She shut her eyes, exhaling slowly. 1,000 questions darted through her mind, but one in particular rose above the rest. How on earth had what should have been a routine stop led to this? The black sedan remained parked at the curb, hazard lights blinking. Rick pulled into traffic, ignoring the angry honks behind him. The seat was hot from the midday sun, and the stale odor of old coffee assaulted Ebony's senses. She felt caged, vulnerable, and outraged all at once. Yet deep beneath the turmoil, A flicker of steely resolve ignited. There would be a reckoning for this. And the man behind the wheel, Officer Rick Monroe, had no idea the magnitude of his mistake. The 20 Honest Precinct station sat at the corner of a busy intersection, a concrete fortress with tinted windows not unlike those Rick had so fervently targeted. As he drove into the side parking lot, Ebony watched pedestrians stream past the high steel fence, their daily routines unbroken. She felt a hollow pit in her stomach. She was about to enter a place few wanted to see, and even fewer entered with dignity intact. Rick parked, turned off the engine, and then stepped out. He opened the rear door and pulled Ebony out none too gently. She stumbled slightly in her heels, causing him to tighten his grip on her forearm. Through a small side entrance, they entered a hallway lined with lockers and a bulletin board plastered with departmental notices. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glare on everything below. A desk sergeant named Margaret Flynn looked up from her computer. She was in her late 40s, hair pulled into a tight bun, face etched by the weight of uncounted shifts. "What we got here, Monroe?" she asked in a bored tone, barely hiding her irritation at more paperwork. "Traffic stop," Rick answered, curtly, not meeting her eyes. Driver was uncooperative, possible illegal tint. "She refused to let me search the vehicle." Sergeant Flynn raised an eyebrow, leaning forward to get a better look at Ebony. "That's it?" Rick glared. She was resisting. Her attitude was. Ebony spoke up, her voice calm but firm. "Sergeant, my name is Ebony Hughes, and I am an attorney licensed by the state of New York. I asked Officer Monroe repeatedly about the basis for this arrest, and I was given no clear explanation." The sergeant's gaze shifted between the two of them. A flicker of suspicion crossed her features. She sighed. "Monroe, you want to process her, put her in holding?" Ebony's lips tightened. If they booked her, there would be a paper trail. That paper trail would become Exhibit A in a lawsuit. Maybe that was a good thing, but it also meant hours, possibly overnight, behind bars, if she couldn't make immediate bail or get a hearing. Rick nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Sergeant Flynn began typing on her computer. "Name?" Ebony responded. "Ebony Marie Hughes." "Address?" "Date of birth." The standard questions followed. With each answer Ebony provided, the sergeant's eyes flicked from the screen to Ebony, then to Rick. The puzzle pieces were piling up in her mind, though she said nothing. Finally, Flynn printed out a form and slid it to Rick. "Booking paperwork. You know what to do." Then she swiveled her attention back to Ebony. "You have a phone call, Miss Hughes. You can use the payphone in the hallway after you're processed." Ebony nodded, grateful for any semblance of courtesy. Rick led her through another doorway, this one opening into a short corridor lined with holding cells. An officer with short, cropped hair and thick, rimmed glasses stood guard. She was young, couldn't have been on the force more than a year or two. Her name tag read Officer Brooks. Rick motioned for Ebony to stand against a dingy off-white wall, posing her for the standard mugshots. He removed the handcuffs, only to clamp them back once the photos were taken. Ebony's face felt hot with rage and embarrassment, but she tried to keep her expression neutral, focusing on future legal recourse. Officer Brooks handed Ebony a small tray to place personal items in: watch, phone, even her earrings. Ebony removed them meticulously, aware that each moment was more documentation of this humiliating ordeal. "What's the charge, Officer Monroe?" Brooks asked quietly, her voice tinged with confusion. "Obstruction and resisting arrest," Rick said. He then pivoted to Ebony. "Are you going to cooperate if we put you in the holding cell, or do I need to search you more thoroughly?" Ebony's jaw clenched. "I have no intention of causing any trouble. I just want my phone call." Rick stared at her. "After you're processed," he repeated. Inside the holding cell, the walls were a washed-out grey, and the stainless steel bench looked as if it had seen countless nights of sorrow and frustration. Ebony sank onto it, ignoring the slight chill of the metal. The door closed behind her with a clang that reverberated through her spine. Across from her sat a woman in tattered clothing, eyes distant and hollow. Another occupant, an older man, reeked of alcohol. Ebony tried not to let her gaze linger. She already felt her presence here was a gross injustice. Time stretched agonizingly. The overhead lights were too bright, the bench too hard, and every second that passed weighed on her. She couldn't help but wonder how long Rick would keep her here, out of spite. Within 15 minutes, Officer Brooks reappeared, unlocking the cell door. "Miss Hughes, you can make your phone call now." Ebony followed her out into the hallway. A single payphone hung on a dirty beige wall. She clutched the receiver with both hands, suddenly feeling an odd wave of relief wash over her. With practiced speed, she dialed the number of her friend and colleague, Amanda Zhao, an assistant district attorney she worked with on multiple cases. The line rang twice before Amanda's voice answered. "Hello, Amanda, it's Ebony," she said, her voice trembling despite her best efforts. "I'm at the 20 Honest Precinct. I've been arrested." The gasp on the other end of the line was immediate. "What? Arrested? For what?" Ebony swallowed, pressing her forehead against the cold metal shelf beneath the phone. "A traffic stop gone wrong. The officer Monroe claimed I was obstructing. He's locked me up on false pretenses." "I'll be right there," Amanda promised. "Don't say anything else to them. I'm calling the precinct commander and our supervising attorney. Hang tight." Ebony felt a surge of gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. Hanging up, she straightened her shoulders. If Amanda was on her way, Ebony had to believe that this nightmare would come to an end soon. But as she stood in that grim hallway, the fluorescent hum drilling into her temples, she also knew that the wheels of bureaucratic justice turned slowly. Even for someone with legal credentials, this fight was just beginning. Returning to the holding cell, she couldn't help but notice Rick leaning against the wall, arms folded, a smug grin etched across his face. It was as though he relished seeing her reduced to these circumstances. Ebony felt her anger rise once more, but she kept her composure, reminding herself that she had the law and the truth on her side. Amanda was coming, and she wouldn't be coming alone. Ebony could almost picture the flurry of phone calls, the internal chatter that would ripple through the district attorney's office once word got out that one of their own had been wrongly arrested. Rick Monroe had unwittingly set himself on a collision course, with forces far beyond his control. Before Amanda could arrive, Ebony sat back down on the cold bench, her mind drifting to how she had ended up in this situation. She recalled the winding path she'd taken from a modest childhood to the fluorescent confines of this holding cell, an attorney now behind bars, if only temporarily. Ebony Marie Hughes was born in Atlanta, Georgia, to parents who worked tirelessly to keep the family afloat. Her mother, Delilah Hughes, was a nurse at Grady Memorial Hospital, clocking extra shifts whenever possible. Her father, Benjamin Hughes, drove a city bus and never complained about the early mornings or late nights. Believing in the dignity of hard work, their household was modest but filled with love. They emphasized education with a near-religious fervor, and Ebony took the lesson to heart. In high school, Ebony excelled, often burying herself in books while her peers attended parties or social gatherings. She didn't feel she was missing out. Education was her ticket to a future that promised more than her parents' hand-to-mouth existence. She joined debate club, where she discovered a talent for public speaking and logical argumentation. Late nights saw her hunched over a desk in the living room, diligently preparing for tournaments. The trophies soon lined the shelves. By her senior year, Ebony's guidance counselor recognized her potential and encouraged her to apply to top universities. She was accepted into Columbia University in New York City, where she majored in political science. It was a culture shock, moving from Atlanta's warmth to the frenetic pace of Manhattan. She had to adapt, learning how to navigate subways, survive brutal winters, and juggle the demands of rigorous coursework. But Ebony thrived on challenges. Her relentless determination earned her a spot at Columbia Law School after graduation. Law school wasn't a breeze. She was surrounded by fiercely competitive classmates, some from privileged backgrounds, others with extraordinary intellect, yet Ebony stood out. She joined the law review, poured hours into research, and even found time to volunteer at local legal aid clinics. These clinics opened her eyes to systemic injustices, especially those affecting minority communities. She saw how the law could be both a shield and a weapon, and she resolved to ensure it was used responsibly. After passing the bar exam on her first try, Ebony landed a position with the state's attorney's office in New York. She focused on civil rights cases, championing individuals who had been mistreated by law enforcement or neglected by a system that sometimes seemed indifferent at best. She earned a reputation for her unwavering commitment, her meticulous case preparation, and her calm but forceful presence in court. Over the years, she had encountered many police officers, most professional, some incompetent, and a rare few who were outright bigoted. But never in her wildest dreams did she envision becoming the victim of an unlawful arrest by one of them. She had dedicated her career to upholding justice, yet here she was, tangled in the system's net because of one cop's arrogance and prejudice. The clang of the cell door brought her back to the present. A different officer, an older man with salt and pepper hair, stepped in. "Miss Hughes," he said, his voice threaded with a hint of respect. "I'm Lieutenant Perez. Your attorney friend is here with the district attorney's office." Ebony stood, crossing her arms. "Thank you, Lieutenant." She walked out, feeling the stares of the others in the cell following her. The hallway felt cavernous. The overhead lights still buzzed, but now Ebony sensed a change in the air, as if the gears of justice were shifting in her favor. She was led to a small, windowless room, commonly used for interviews. The cinder block walls were painted a drab beige. Inside, Amanda Zhao waited, her expression grave. Standing next to her was an imposing figure Ebony immediately recognized, Alicia Mendez, the deputy chief of the Civil Rights Division under the New York District Attorney's Office. Amanda opened her arms, greeting Ebony with a brisk hug. "Are you all right?" Ebony nodded, exhaling a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. "I'll be fine once I get out of here." Alicia Mendez stepped forward. "I've spoken with the precinct commander and internal affairs. They're going to release you soon. But I want you to know we're not letting this slide. We're launching an official inquiry into Officer Monroe's conduct." Relief washed over Ebony, though anger still simmered beneath the surface. "Thank you. This should never have happened." Amanda placed a comforting hand on Ebony's shoulder. "Let's get you out of here first. Then we'll talk about the next steps." A small knock on the door preceded it, swinging open. Sergeant Flynn entered, looking visibly perturbed. "Miss Hughes, you're free to go. The charges, if you can even call them, that are being dropped immediately." "No apology," Ebony noted. "What about Officer Monroe?" she asked. The sergeant glanced uneasily at Alicia Mendez, who was towering with an air of authority. "That's for internal affairs to decide." Ebony stepped out of the room, closely followed by Amanda and Alicia. The tension in the hallway was palpable. Officers milled around, some throwing guilty or uncomfortable looks at Ebony, others pretending to focus on their tasks. They all sensed the magnitude of what had transpired. A line had been crossed, and the repercussions would not be trivial. As Ebony retrieved her personal belongings from Officer Brooks, she noted the younger officer's shy smile, a wordless apology. Ebony offered a curt nod in return, acknowledging the gesture without exonerating the department's failing. This fiasco wasn't just about one officer's racism, it was about a flawed system that allowed men like Rick Monroe to flourish unchecked for years. Moments later, Ebony stepped out into the crisp afternoon sunshine alongside Amanda and Alicia. The city seemed unchanged, buzzing along as it always did, but she felt different, raw, determined, and strangely liberated. There was no question in her mind. She would seek justice not just for herself, but for all the others who hadn't the platform or resources to fight back. "It's time to make a statement," Alicia said solemnly, scanning the busy street. "Don't talk to reporters yet, but trust me, this story is going to explode as soon as the media catches wind. We'll formulate a legal strategy." Ebony straightened her blazer, smoothing out the wrinkles from her time behind bars. "I'm ready," she said, "whatever it takes." A taxi screeched to a halt at the curb, spitting out a passenger. Amanda hailed it, and the three women slid into the back seat. As the taxi merged into traffic, Ebony couldn't help but glance at the precinct building shrinking behind them. If Rick Monroe had wanted to make an example of her, he had succeeded, but not in the way he intended. Now Ebony would be the one shining a spotlight on him, and on the entire broken system he represented. By the time Ebony reached her apartment in the Upper West Side, her phone was exploding with messages. Colleagues, friends, and even distant acquaintances had heard rumors of her arrest. Some messages read with disbelief, others demanded immediate details. Ebony sank onto her couch, mind still spinning from the humiliating ordeal at the precinct, and scanned the barrage of texts. Amanda had already sent a thorough email summarizing the situation to Ebony's entire legal team at the state's attorney's office. The wheels were turning, and Ebony could practically feel the throbbing pulse of outrage that would soon sweep through their professional community. It didn't take long for mainstream media outlets to pick up the story. By late afternoon, Ebony had fielded voicemails from 3 local news stations and a national cable network requesting her side. She was no stranger to media, but usually she was the one providing statements on legal cases, not the subject of them. Her immediate instinct was caution. Alicia Mendez had advised them to wait, to coordinate a measured response. But Ebony knew how quickly narratives could spin out of control if not addressed promptly. She turned on her TV, flipping between channels. Her heart dropped a little when she caught her own name on the chyron of a local news broadcast. State attorney claims wrongful arrest. A picture of her in professional attire flashed across the screen, quickly replaced by a file clip of the 20 Honest Precinct's facade. A wave of exhaustion overcame her. She hadn't slept properly in over 24 hours. Deciding she needed a moment of peace, she powered off her phone and collapsed onto her bed. The promise of a short nap turned into a deep sleep, and by the time she stirred, twilight had fallen. The city lights glowed outside her window. Rubbing her eyes, she sat up, only to see the red voicemail alert blinking furiously on her phone. She sighed, turned the phone back on, and dialed into her messages. The second she heard the beep, Amanda's urgent voice filled her ear. "Ebony, I've got a doozy for you. Internal Affairs just called me. They have evidence bodycam footage that is pretty damning for Monroe. They've flagged prior complaints from minority citizens. Something big is brewing. Call me as soon as you can." The next message was from Alicia Mendez. "Ebony, call me back. Officer Monroe's track record is worse than we thought. There's a press conference scheduled at City Hall tomorrow morning. The mayor's going to address the situation." Her phone beeped again to indicate a third message from someone Ebony didn't recognize. "Miss Hughes, this is Winston Davison, an investigative reporter with the New York Times. We have sources indicating a pattern of misconduct in the 20 Honest Precinct. I'd like to interview you regarding Officer Monroe and your experience. Please call me back at your earliest convenience." Ebony's stomach knotted. One event in a lifetime of carefully building her reputation had thrust her into the center of a media and legal storm. Part of her wanted to lash out, to shout the truth from every platform. Another part knew she had to proceed with care. She was not only a victim here, but also a legal professional who had to follow protocol. She dialed Amanda first. Her friend picked up on the first ring. "Ebony?" "Yeah, it's me, thank God. You all right?" "Been better. What's going on with IA?" Amanda exhaled. "They've opened a formal investigation. Monroe is on administrative leave. Apparently, he's had multiple complaints, verbal abuse, excessive force, racially charged remarks, though none of them ever stuck. The body cam footage from your arrest is an even bigger concern for the department. It shows the entire stop, Ebony, and it doesn't look good for him." Ebony felt a surge of relief. "Body cam footage? That's perfect. It's evidence he can't twist." "Exactly," Amanda said. "It clearly shows him berating you, ignoring your explanations, and using questionable force. The real kicker is the audio of him calling you, well, let's just say you can guess the kind of slur he used." Ebony's jaw clenched. She'd suspected he harbored bigotry, but hearing about an actual slur made her stomach churn. That's disgusting. That's why the department is scrambling. The press is going to feast on this. The mayor's already called a conference to talk about police reform or something along those lines. He wants to get ahead of the scandal. Ebony closed her eyes, inhaling slowly to steady herself. "All right, let's make sure we coordinate. I don't want to jeopardize any investigation by giving an unfiltered statement." "Agreed," Amanda replied. "We're meeting at Alicia's office first thing tomorrow morning, 7:30 a.m. We'll do a thorough briefing and decide how best to approach the press and any potential lawsuit." After hanging up, Ebony slumped back on her couch. It was well after 8 p.m. She forced herself to eat a quick dinner, cold leftovers from the fridge, before diving into her laptop. She typed up everything she remembered about the stop, the handcuffing, the jail cell, the words Rick used, his demeanor, every detail. Documenting these events was second nature to her as an attorney, but this time it felt personal, raw. She included the names of the officers she'd encountered, the chain of events, and her exact emotional responses. If there was to be a trial or civil suit, she wanted her memory fresh and undisputed. Emails and text messages continued pouring in. She responded politely but succinctly, mostly repeating that she was unable to comment in detail until the official statements were made. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd always been the one telling witnesses and plaintiffs, "Don't say too much yet. Let the process work." Now, she was the one heeding that same advice. Finally, she closed her laptop, feeling the weight of the day settle in her bones. She recalled her parents back in Atlanta. She hadn't had the heart to call them and explain yet. The last thing they needed was to worry about their daughter being thrown behind bars. But she promised herself she would call them tomorrow, after she knew more about the plan. Curling up in bed, Ebony stared at the ceiling, her mind whirling with possibilities. For years, she'd fought from the inside to reform the justice system, believing in the good that could be achieved through legal channels. Now she was forced to confront how broken those channels were. She had become the very statistic she'd spent her career trying to eliminate, a black person unjustly arrested and forced to prove her own innocence against a cop's word. Yet, as she drifted into an uneasy sleep, Ebony felt a flicker of something akin to hope. She had resources, she had allies, and she had the truth. In the morning, she would walk into that meeting armed with every ounce of her legal training, her moral conviction, and her unwavering resolve. If Officer Monroe and the 20 Honest Precinct thought they could do this to her without consequences, they had another thing coming. Morning broke with a crisp energy in Manhattan. Ebony arrived at Alicia Mendez's spacious office downtown, where tall windows overlooked the bustling metropolis below. The sun glinted off the surrounding skyscrapers, reflecting onto the polished wooden floors in golden patches. Amanda, Alicia, and two other members of the Civil Rights Division, Jacob Stein and Caroline Liu, were already seated around a large circular table. Alicia waved Ebony in. "We've just started. Grab a coffee and join us." Ebony poured herself a cup from a silver carafe on a side table, then took a seat. Jacob, a tall man with a gentle demeanor, placed a thick file on the table. "This is Monroe's record," he said. "Internal Affairs faxed it over this morning." Ebony glanced at the papers, feeling her stomach twist. The list of complaints spanned several years: alleged racist remarks, questionable use of force incidents, multiple traffic stops that ended with minority drivers alleging harassment. "Why wasn't he disciplined?" she asked, incredulous. Alicia tapped a finger on the file. "He was disciplined administratively, a few mild reprimands. But the majority of the complaints were labeled unsubstantiated, probably due to lack of conclusive evidence or witness recanting. It's a pattern in many precincts. Officers like Monroe slip through the cracks, as long as their behavior doesn't lead to a major scandal." "Well, this is definitely a major scandal now," Amanda said grimly. "We've got body cam footage and a high-profile victim." Everyone in the room shifted, the weight of the situation palpable. Caroline, a meticulous attorney known for her thorough research, spoke next. "We should consider both criminal and civil avenues. The district attorney's office might pursue criminal charges for false arrest or civil rights violations if we can prove that Monroe's actions were willful and prejudiced." "What about Ebony's position in this?" Amanda asked, turning to Alicia. "She's the one who suffered the harm." "Exactly," Alicia said. "Ebony, you have every right to file a civil suit against Monroe and the City of New York. That's entirely separate from any criminal proceedings the DA decides to pursue against him." Ebony sipped her coffee, the hot liquid grounding her. "I'm leaning toward filing a lawsuit," she said. "Not just for me, but to expose the systemic failures that allow officers like Monroe to operate with impunity. If it helps push reform, it's worth it." Alicia nodded. "We'll support you in that." Jacob flipped through a few pages. Monroe's got a union-appointed attorney, no surprise. And the police union is already voicing concerns about a media witch hunt. We can expect them to circle the wagons around him. Amanda rolled her eyes. Typical, but they can't spin the footage in his favor. It's too damning. A knock on the door interrupted the conversation. An intern peeked in, looking flustered. "Miss Mendez, the mayor's press conference is starting in 5 minutes." All eyes turned to the clock. Alicia reached for a remote on the table and turned on a sleek wall-mounted TV. The screen lit up, showing the mayor's podium in front of City Hall, flanked by the New York state flag. Reporters jostled for position, their cameras pointed at the dais. The mayor, Gerald Whitfield, a tall man with graying temples, stepped up to the microphone. Behind him stood the police commissioner, a steely-faced woman named Barbara Connors. They both looked tense, as though bracing for an onslaught of questions. Whitfield cleared his throat. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I've called this press conference to address recent allegations of misconduct by an NYPD officer in the 20 Honest precinct involving a wrongful arrest of a state attorney, Miss Ebony Hughes. I want to be absolutely clear. The City of New York does not condone racial profiling or the abuse of power by any of our officers." A flurry of camera flashes lit up the scene. The mayor continued, choosing his words carefully. "A thorough investigation is underway by Internal Affairs, and we will not hesitate to take appropriate disciplinary action if the officer in question is found guilty of wrongdoing. Miss Hughes' rights and dignity should have been respected, and for that, I extend an apology on behalf of the city's administration." Ebony felt a strange mix of relief and anger. An official apology was progress, but it still felt insufficient compared to what she had endured and what so many others endured without any public outcry. The mayor paused before concluding, "We remain committed to transparency and will keep the public informed as the investigation unfolds. Thank you." He stepped back, and Commissioner Connors took his place, giving a more technical rundown of the procedures for handling officer misconduct. When the press was allowed to ask questions, they erupted in a frenzy. "Mr. Mayor, have you spoken to Miss Hughes personally?" "Commissioner, do you have any comment on whether Officer Monroe's bodycam footage will be released? How do you plan to address concerns from minority communities about policing tactics?" Alicia muted the broadcast. "This is just the beginning," she said. "We can expect the media storm to intensify. We need to plan Ebony's press strategy," Amanda added. "There's going to be a wave of interview requests." Ebony nodded, bracing herself. "I'll do it, but let's do it carefully. I want to speak to the facts, highlight the bigger issue. This can't just be about my individual case." Alicia stood, smoothing her blazer. "Agreed. Let's schedule a press conference of our own in a day or two. That will give us time to finalize legal motions and gather the right supporting statements, possibly from community leaders who've dealt with Monroe's nonsense before. The more voices we have, the harder it'll be for the union or the department to paint this as an isolated incident." The team continued ironing out details: who would handle Ebony's official statements, what documents they would release to the press, and how they might proceed with filing a civil lawsuit. By the time they adjourned, Ebony felt an undercurrent of resolve in the room, as if everyone had realized the gravity of what they were about to undertake, toppling the carefully guarded facade that had shielded Rick Monroe for too long. Alicia walked Ebony to the elevator. "Keep in mind, Ebony, this won't be easy. The police union will fight tooth and nail. Monroe might try to discredit you by digging up any dirt they can find, even if it's non-existent. They'll manufacture rumors if they must." Ebony squared her shoulders. "Let them try. I have nothing to hide, and I'm tired of living in a city where people who look like me have to worry about being pulled over for no reason." Alicia pressed the elevator button. "We're behind you, Ebony. We'll make sure your voice is heard." As the elevator doors slid open, Ebony stepped inside, her reflection mirrored in the gleaming panels. "Thank you," she said softly. When the doors shut, she let out a shaky breath. A sense of both dread and determination flooded her. She was about to become a very public face of a battle that was as old as American policing itself. And behind her calm exterior, Ebony felt the flicker of righteous anger blazing stronger than ever. True to Alicia's prediction, the following days were a whirlwind. The bodycam footage surfaced online, leaked by an anonymous source within the NYPD who'd apparently had enough of Monroe's antics. The video quickly went viral, fueling an already raging public debate. In the footage, viewers saw Rick Monroe's face twisted with hostility as he demanded Ebony step out of her car. They heard his dismissive tone, the racial undertones, and that vile slur he muttered under his breath, just barely caught by the mic. Social media lit up in outrage, with hashtags like #JusticeForEbony and #ReformMePD trending nationwide. Ebony found herself the reluctant figurehead of a conversation about institutional racism, police accountability, and the precarious position of Black Americans, even those wielding professional authority. She gave carefully choreographed interviews, appearing on local stations, CNN and MSNBC. In each, she maintained her composure, reiterating that the real issue wasn't just one racist cop, but a system that shielded him for years. The backlash against Monroe intensified with each broadcast of the footage. Activists organized protests outside the 20 Honest precinct, holding signs reading "No more rogue cops" and "Black Lives Matter." Community leaders called for a complete overhaul of the precinct's leadership. The police commissioner tried to placate the public by announcing a comprehensive review of all disciplinary cases from the last decade, but few believed it would fix the root problem. Ebony's civil lawsuit, filed by a high-profile legal team that included Alicia Mendez, demanded significant damages for false arrest, violation of civil rights, and emotional distress. But more importantly, it called for mandatory retraining of officers, an independent oversight committee for police misconduct, and a transparent process for reviewing complaints. In response, the police union launched a campaign of their own, claiming Ebony's demands were unrealistic and labeling her an attention-seeking opportunist. Some union representatives appeared on talk radio and Fox News, painting Monroe as a good cop caught in a political crossfire. Ebony steeled herself, refusing to stoop to their level. The truth was on her side, and the footage was impossible to refute. Meanwhile, Rick Monroe had gone silent. Placed on administrative leave, he retreated from the public eye. Rumors circulated that he'd hired a seasoned defense attorney with a reputation for aggressive tactics. Ebony braced for whatever smears or counter-accusations might be hurled her way. Amid the turbulence, she found solace in her tight circle of friends and mentors. Amanda remained a rock, helping Ebony manage the media requests and coordinate with Alicia's team. On evenings when the pressure felt suffocating, Ebony would invite Amanda over for takeout and wine, where they'd decompress on Ebony's couch, ranting about the day's drama. "You holding up okay?" Amanda asked one such night, swirling her glass of Pinot Noir. "It's a lot to take on, even for you." Ebony leaned back, rubbing her temples. "I'm tired, Amanda. The attention is exhausting." I'm trying to keep my emotions in check, but every time I see that footage or hear that slur, it's like reliving the moment. Amanda reached out, squeezing Ebony's hand. "Remember why you're doing this. It's bigger than you. So many people never get the chance to fight back." A ghost of a smile curved Ebony's lips. "I know. That's what keeps me going." The next morning, Ebony discovered a stack of letters delivered to her office, some from strangers who wrote heartfelt notes of solidarity, sharing their own experiences of racial profiling. Others sent hate mail, accusing her of stirring up trouble or worse. She read through each one, letting the supportive words reinforce her resolve and dismissing the vitriol as proof that her stand was necessary. At a particularly tense point, Ebony received a tip from Winston Davison at the New York Times, the investigative reporter who'd left her that voicemail. "I've uncovered some files from a few years ago," he told her over the phone. "There's an internal memo suggesting Monroe was nearly fired after a violent stop involving a teenage boy. But the precinct buried it. Care to comment?" Ebony felt her heart pounding. "I can't comment on evidence I haven't seen, but if you have proof, publish it. People need to know." The Times ran an expose detailing Monroe's long history of aggression and the internal politics that kept him on the force. The story rocked the city. Calls for accountability and large-scale reforms intensified. City council members floated proposals for a civilian oversight board. The mayor's office scrambled to salvage public trust. All the while, Ebony kept her eyes on the prize, meaningful change, not mere headlines. The day of the preliminary hearing for her lawsuit approached, and she prepared meticulously. This hearing would determine if her civil suit had enough merit to proceed to full trial. Given the overwhelming evidence, it was almost a formality, but Ebony refused to take chances. Finally, the morning of the hearing arrived. Dressed in a tailored navy suit, Ebony entered the courthouse, flanked by Alicia Mendez and Amanda Zhao. Cameras flashed in her face. Reporters shouted questions, but she walked with her head high, ignoring the cacophony. In a twist of bitter irony, she was now the plaintiff in a courtroom, seeking justice against a cop who had once deemed her unworthy of the most basic civil decency. Inside the courtroom, Ebony saw Rick Monroe for the first time since her arrest. He sat at the defense table, looking sullen, his once cocky demeanor tempered by the scrutiny he now faced. His attorney glared at Ebony, then returned to reviewing papers. As Ebony took her seat, she felt a surge of conflicting emotions, anger, yes, but also a kind of pity for a man who had allowed hatred to poison his life. The gavel banged, and the judge, an older woman with keen, discerning eyes, called the hearing to order. The hush that fell over the court felt electric. This wasn't just a routine preliminary hearing, it was a public test of a system Ebony had dedicated her life to. Win or lose, the implications would resonate far beyond these walls. The preliminary hearing was swift and decisive. With bodycam evidence, witness statements, and a track record of complaints against Rick Monroe, the judge had little hesitation in allowing Ebony's civil suit to proceed. Monroe's attorney tried to argue that Ebony had been combative and that Monroe had used reasonable suspicion, but the judge's piercing gaze spoke volumes. This was a losing battle for the defense, and everyone in the room knew it. Within weeks, the city's legal counsel, fearing a public trial that would further erode trust in the NYPD, offered a settlement. The figure was sizable enough to make headlines. But Ebony didn't rush to accept. Her focus was on systemic reform. She insisted that any settlement include mandatory reforms for the 20 Honest Precinct, comprehensive bias training, a restructured complaint review process, and an oversight committee with real teeth. At first, city representatives balked. Yet, under mounting pressure from the press, community activists, and even moderate voices in local government, they conceded. The settlement Ebony signed not only provided a financial payout, but also bound the precinct to a set of sweeping changes. Critics called it ambitious, even radical, but Ebony stood firm. She would not trade justice for a mere check. Meanwhile, Internal Affairs wrapped up their investigation into Monroe. The findings were damning. Repeated use of excessive force, documented racist remarks, and a pattern of targeting minority drivers without probable cause. Faced with undeniable evidence, the police commissioner fired Monroe. Criminal charges soon followed: official misconduct, false arrest, and perjury. In a final note of irony, Ebony Hughes had no direct hand in these criminal proceedings. The system that once briefly jailed her was now prosecuting her former jailer. News of Monroe's termination and pending trial spread quickly. Public reaction was a mixture of relief and cautious optimism. Some wondered if this was truly a turning point or simply a rare case of accountability triggered by the victim's high-profile status. On the day Monroe was officially indicted, Ebony watched the news alone in her apartment. She saw the camera zoom in on his face as he left the courthouse, a hoodie pulled over his head, shielding himself from a barrage of shouted questions. In that moment, she felt the weight of karma, a heavy, inescapable force that had finally come crashing down on a man who had long evaded its reach. Yet Ebony wasn't one to gloat. She had witnessed firsthand how easily power could corrupt. Instead, she channeled her energy into ongoing reform efforts. She hosted workshops for young attorneys interested in civil rights litigation and worked with city council members to broaden the oversight committees to other precincts as well. Slowly, she saw the seeds of transformation being planted. Her personal life also began to settle. She reconnected with her parents in Atlanta, who had been both worried and proud during her ordeal. They joked that Ebony had inherited her mother's stubborn streak and her father's sense of justice. "We always knew you were meant to shake things up," her father teased over the phone. "Just didn't realize you'd cause such a ruckus in New York City." Late one autumn evening, Ebony found herself walking through Central Park, reflecting on the tumultuous journey. The crisp air carried the scent of fallen leaves, and a soft glow from the lamps lit her path. She thought about how easily her life could have taken a darker turn if she hadn't been an attorney, if she hadn't had resources and connections. She remembered the frightened look of others in that holding cell, people without legal knowledge, without a voice. A sense of responsibility washed over her. This is only the beginning, she told herself. The changes implemented at the 20 Honest precinct were a start, but the problem was larger than any single location. Still, the fact that an abusive cop had been held accountable felt like a small victory in a larger war. As she passed a group of teens laughing on a park bench, Ebony couldn't help but smile. Maybe tomorrow or the next day or the next month, one of these kids would get pulled over. If that happened, maybe, just maybe, the policies she'd fought for would make that encounter safer, fairer. That thought gave her solace. Returning home, she checked her voicemail. A message from Alicia Mendez played. "Ebony, the city council just passed the oversight bill. It's official. Call me." Ebony grinned, a surge of satisfaction dancing through her. The fight was worth it. Every sleepless night, every confrontation with doubters, every piece of hate mail. Officer Rick Monroe was now a cautionary tale for other cops who might misuse their power, and Ebony's story had become a rallying cry for meaningful change. She sank onto her couch, letting her shoulders relax. Outside, the city that never slept hummed with life. She felt a profound connection to its myriad stories, including the painful ones yet to be heard. "I'm not done," she thought, "but this is a good place to pause and celebrate a win. This tale has been a true roller coaster of injustice, courage, and ultimate redemption." From the instant Officer Monroe cuffed Ebony Hughes on a baseless charge to the shocking moment he realized she was a state attorney poised to fight back, the story underscores that unchecked power must be challenged, and that truth, fueled by unwavering resolve, can disrupt even the most entrenched corruption. Ebony's ordeal demonstrates that nobody is fully shielded from bias, yet nobody is powerless against it either. Her determination, underpinned by a relentless pursuit of justice, ignited crucial reforms that continue influencing policing today. If this narrative struck a chord, if it inspired you, resonated with you, or simply made you pause and reflect, please like, share, and subscribe to this channel. By spreading these messages, we can spark broader conversations and fuel meaningful change. Your support ensures that stories championing truth and justice will continue to reach those who need them most.